justice and other sorts of social justice issues in Miami-Dade County, and she's about to finish up her PhD this semester or next semester, and she's working now at the Office of Civic and Community Engagement at the University of Miami. So let's hear.
All right.
We'll hear
Thank
what
you.
Emily has to tell us.
Yeah, and thank you. I wanted to thank Dr. Ross for letting me come and share what I've been working on with you, and also to recognize my advisor, Gail Hollander, is here in Global and Sociocultural Studies. And this project is, like Dr. Ross said, part of the Ultra X project, which is bringing together natural and social sciences around vulnerabilities in South Florida, and this is particularly in the coastal vulnerabilities portion. As this map back here shows, Miami is in one of the top tier cities for vulnerability to climate change and sea level rise. So it makes an important issue for us to be engaged with here in Miami, and particularly be looking at social and economic issues as well. And because I'm going to be talking about lots of different things, I thought I'd start with sort of the takeaway, which is the need to understand and modify human and social forces is far more important than any technological answer to greater resilience. And so it means basically that our futures are going to be determined as much by social and economic forces as they are by the physical forces of climate change. And this is an idea that comes out of some work started in the 1970s under political ecology, which is a field in the social sciences that looks at the relationships between social and physical processes, and with the idea that there's really no such thing as a natural disaster. So, for example, research done by folks like Michael Watts on drought and famine in northern Nigeria found that what actually caused a famine wasn't just the drought. You have a drought that reduces food production, but when he looked at the villages that were experiencing this famine, found that what had happened was that people had reduced their production of traditional livelihood crops in favor of cash crops for paying taxes or for trading on the global market. And so it was actually that shift away from traditional crops that made them more vulnerable to the famine. And so the famine wasn't just a result of the drought, the physical process, but was a result of those changes that had occurred as a result of colonialism and engagement with the global economy. And so that's what we mean by no such thing as a natural disaster, that disasters happen because of physical but also because of social and economic processes. And another example of this is Hurricane Katrina, of course, when a major storm hit the city. But we saw that who was affected by this, and the deaths that happened were located in particular portions of the city where people were more vulnerable because of housing conditions, because of planning, because of infrastructure, because of inequality in the city, all things that were caused by human forces as much as those physical forces. And so a related sort of train of thought is evolution of environmental thought. Early in the 20th century, we had movements for preservation and conservation that created the national parks, and this was in a reaction to industrialism and to the degradation of environment from the industrial development. And that really viewed nature as this thing that was sort of separate and apart from humans. It was pristine, it was away, it was to be protected, it was to be gated and guarded away from human activity that was degrading. But in the 60s, then we started to see a sort of different look at the environment, which was the relationship between environment and human health. So the publication of works like Silent Spring on the impacts of DDT, also concerned over nuclear weapons, and starting to be more concerned about how the relationship nature impacted humans and human health. And then in the 1980s, we start to see movements around environmental justice. And so this had to do with the siting of toxic waste dumps and sewage treatment plants and facilities that tended to be located in poor or in minority neighborhoods, because these are neighborhoods where people have fewer resources, less power in local government, and that's where these toxic facilities tended to get cited. And so there started to be movements and reactions against this environmental racism, because this reframed the idea of environment, not just as something that was far away and separate from human activity, but the environment is about where we live and work and play. It's our neighborhoods, it's our homes, it's our surroundings. And so we still have these different strains of thought in the environmental movement today, and they sort of coexist, and there's tensions and still separations based along a lot of class and racial lines. But understanding these different strains of thought, I think, helps understand our actions over climate change as well. And sort of another way of framing this issue is humans, restating humans and nature are not separate categories, not just a binary dualism, but that human and natural systems are inextricably linked in webs of mutual causation, and that climate change is one of the big is a major example of this. That now with the change in the climate, there's no place, there's no person on Earth that isn't affected by this, and that they are affecting each other, the human and the environmental changes. And so what I wanted to look at was social vulnerability, and the relationship between social and physical vulnerability with regards to climate change. And so social vulnerability, gender, for example, well, women will tend to be more have the responsibility for taking care of the household, may not be the ones that are getting the relief funds after a disaster, or economic security, what sort of resources do people have to prepare or cope or deal with disasters. And there's been research on this from Hurricane Katrina and Andrew that shows that risk isn't evenly distributed, and marginalized groups with less political power tend to be more vulnerable. And so people who look at vulnerability from the hazards and disasters perspective have gone from sort of this old model that was vulnerability just equals your exposure to a hazard, through the insights from political ecology, disasters are not natural, to now we have a sort of systems model, this disaster resilience of place, where you have a process now of the experience with a disaster prompts social learning, it prompts adaptation, it prompts more preparedness, and so you've got these feedback loops that have been incorporated into the model. But there's still some problems with this, that the majority of the solutions that get proposed out of this line of thinking are still technological solutions rather than really focusing on this social vulnerability and human security. So we don't see in here differentiation by different socioeconomic status. This is sort of all lumped in together, and this sort of contextual vulnerability isn't really accounted for in these kind of models. And so we've had some development in sort of the thinking about outcome vulnerability versus contextual vulnerability. Are we thinking about the outcomes after a disaster happens, or are we thinking about the context of what makes people vulnerable in the first place? Which has led to thinking that vulnerability assessment should be not approached as a point in time where you measure a particular time what vulnerability is and who's vulnerable, but that it's a dynamic notion, and it's produced through these interactions, historic interactions across economic, cultural, and social processes. And there are good reasons for adopting a human security approach. Obviously, increased resiliency of households leads to fewer disasters and better recovery. We already do have solutions in terms of healthcare and distribution of resources, and incorporating a human security approach into adaptation can increase legitimacy and the effectiveness of solutions. When people are included, that tends to increase legitimacy. And then obviously the ethical component, that those who are impacted the most by climate change are the people who contributed the least to it. And so what I wanted to do is take these ideas and sort of see how they work here in Miami with regards to climate change and vulnerability. And so I chose Miami Beach because it was sort of the obvious place where you see these beginning impacts of sea level rise with the flooding that's been happening. And so questions I had, what are the hazards? What hazards do the early stages of sea level rise pose for urban ecology, and how does this impact urban life? So I've done interviews with municipal officials and civil engineers, observation of conditions in neighborhoods during high tides and rain events, and correlations with meteorological and tidal data. Another question, how are residents and businesses in Miami Beach vulnerable to sea level rise? For which I did household, and I guess I should say business interviews with business owners. And how is vulnerability understood among the South Florida Climate Governance Network, and how is this expressed in planning action so far? So I've interviewed key officials, reviewed documents from planning meetings, and attended lots and lots of conferences on climate change adaptation. So some of you, if you've been following this topic, this might be familiar to you. But starting with the physical side of this problem, the physical impacts, this is projections of sea level rise for South Florida, which is 9 to 24 inches by 2030 and 19 to 57 inches by 2100. And these projections were created by the South Florida Regional Climate Change Compact up in the corner, which is a compact of the 4 southern counties of Broward, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Monroe. And they had a committee of scientists and government officials that looked at the evidence and put these projections together. And so for Miami Beach, the reason that sea level rise is significant, obviously, is because Miami Beach is very low. So when you look at this LIDAR elevation data, you can see the average elevation here in the south part of Miami Beach is about 4 feet. So when you're talking a couple feet of sea level rise, that makes a big difference. And one of the ways of looking at assessing vulnerability to sea level rise is to do this inundation mapping, where you take the elevation, the LIDAR data, and put on top of it different graphical representations of sea level rise. And so this is not a hydrologic model, this is basically just a visual representation created through GIS. And they were done by Pete Harlem, who's not here, but I always like to thank him for all the GIS help that he's given. And then down over in the corner here, this is important, this is the tidal prism. So in South Florida, the tide varies by about 2 feet per day. So at high tide, it's a foot above average sea level, and at low tide, it's a foot below. And so again, when you're talking about a place that's, you know, maybe 2 or 3 feet of elevation, that 2-foot difference in the tide is important.
It should be pointed out too that that map is actually worse than it looks on the screen, because the western side of Miami Beach is on. If you look at the aerial surveys from the 20s, it was mangrove, and so it was filled in with peat, and the fill was added on top of the peat, and then buildings were added on top of the fill, and subsidence is still going on. So it's not just sea level rise, which is what's in the model, but also subsidence not in the model is going to be even worse.
Yeah, from what I understand, the subsidence isn't really that big of an issue in this area.
On
Areas
the west side
like,
there?
sorry?
On the west side of
Yeah, yeah. I mean, not that significant from what I understand, but
okay.
You know, in areas like New Orleans, I think that certainly is true. That you talk about relative sea level rise then, because you have the sea level rise plus the subsidence. But the key to understanding how the water and tides act on Miami Beach is the drainage system. And so Miami Beach's drainage system was built in the 1930s, and you can see here this is one of the outfalls. So when rain falls on the streets, it collects in the streets, and it flows out into the bay through one of these outfalls, which is the one right there at 10th Street on the bay. And you can see where the high water line is here. So when this outfall, what that means is that when the tide is high, it's actually above this hole here, this outfall. And that's increased over time. So when the drainage system was built in the 1930s, the sea level was about 6 inches lower than it is now. And so over time, you've had this increase. And what that means is that when you get high tide, and when it's a particularly high tide, you get water flowing back up through these pipes, and it can flow back up into the street. And so I decided to do some ethnographic observations and see how this worked at some locations around Miami Beach. And this is one location, a food market on a street that tends to experience this high tide flooding pretty severely. And then I looked at the water level data, which is available from NOAA, and this is the Virginia Key Tide Station, which is the closest one to the site on Miami Beach. And so the blue is the prediction, the tide prediction, so I could look at the tide predictions and see what day would be good to go out and do these observations, when the tide would be highest. And then the red is the actual observations. And so on this day, the tide was actually about a half a foot higher than it was predicted. And so there's a lot of reasons for this, mostly probably having to do with weather. Although when I talked with folks from NOAA, they said, you know, it really isn't possible to determine exactly why the tide is higher on any given day. There's a lot of factors that could go into it. Plus also probably the fact that this may account for some sea level rise, because the averages, the model is built based on data collected over these 30-year epochs, which is already, I think now, like 10, I can't remember, 10, 14 years in the past. So it's possible that that's already some sea level rise, it's weather conditions. But essentially the folks from NOAA were like, well, this is really too small for us to investigate or to figure out what's really going on. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to say, because it shows how adaptation strategies and measurements really vary from local level to local level. So a federal agency like NOAA may not be that concerned about half a foot difference of tide, but here in South Florida it actually is significant for us. And so what happens when the tide is particularly high in front of this store, the picture that I showed earlier, is that they put the water ponds here in the street. There's an outfall down there on the corner where it comes and then flows in front of the street. And so what they do is they put out these metal planks that they bought at Home Depot a couple years ago. And so this is at 9 o'clock. I took what I did was take photos and then measure the time, note the time at which I took these photos and what different actions were happening. So they put out these planks at 9 o'clock a.m. and then later I went and correlated with the tidal data. So when the tide was 1.15 NAVD, that was the action that was taking place on the street. And about a half hour later, you can see that it's even worse. And now you can still go down the street, but you're even getting wet there on the sidewalk, and the water is coming right up under those planks, and you can see the increase there in the tide as well. And then eventually you get people walking through with bags on their feet. There's a laundromat, so she's coming from the laundromat. And a lot of these are people who live right around this corner. Miami Beach is a very pedestrian environment. And so people will continue going to shops and doing things that they have to do, but they have to wade through this water to do it.
Pretty saline water, or I mean, is it brackish saline? What do you know what the salinity is there?
Yeah, I did go out one time with the can't remember what it's called, the thing where you measure where you measure the salinity of the water, and it's salt water. I don't have the measurement for it, but that's what it is. And so, for people who are in, say, wheelchairs, which is a hardship, people are like walking down the middle of the street while the cars are going by, and that woman, walking through the landscaping. So it is an inconvenience for people. And then the tide goes back down, and the water goes away, and they take the planks away, and a couple hours later, you wouldn't really notice that anything had happened earlier. So what I wanted to see was, if I could arrive at some measure of what the impact of these tides are on these particular locations. So this is a sidewalk index, and basically measures the amount of time that
the store would have had to put out those planks in front of their store so that people could get over and into their store. So basically the amount of disruption that they've experienced because of this phenomenon. And so what I did was take the time and, you know, what tide level that it was at when those actions happened, and then took the tidal data and calculated the amount of time that these tidal events had been happening. And so in 2012, you can see that it was much higher than it had been in any year previously. And some of that was due to Hurricane Sandy. We got some storm surge during Hurricane Sandy, but that wasn't the only thing that was happening. There was other events as well. And the other reason I did this, and so you can see that, you know, at least, you know, this is not proving that sea level rise, you know, is happening or climate change exists, but it certainly, you can say that there have been more of these disruptive flooding incidents over the last 15 years. And the other reason I did this was to correlate with people's perceptions, so the people that I had interviewed, because I was asking people, and so one of the interesting things about working on this project was that I started this research at the end of 2011, and this was really before the wave of concern about climate change had sort of hit. It was before Hurricane Sandy, and so now we've got media reports on climate change, we've got lots of things happening, but you know, when I started doing this, it wasn't really that clear that people were thinking about this or how they were talking about it. So most people that I talked to felt like the flooding had been getting worse in the last 4 or 5 years, and that seems to be borne out by this chart. Although there were people who said, you know, I've lived on Miami Beach 20 years, it's always flooded here. Some people said it's gotten better because of the city's improved the infrastructure. So I wouldn't say there was a consensus, but probably the majority who felt that things had gotten worse in the last 4 or 5 years, and this seems to bear that out. And so from the household interviews, well, the household and the business owner interviews that I did, I broke them down into basically 3 categories, and I'd say that there were the folks I'm calling non-actors, people who either don't believe that the flooding is getting worse or think that there isn't anything that we can do about it, and that might be because they think it's either just a sort of a natural, you know, thing, it's nature, natural cycle, or people who think that it is related to human activity, but it's related in the sense of sort of this change in society and the speeding up of technology. And so people talk about things like the internet, and you know, people who feel like society is sort of speeding up and things are changing, and they related it more to that than to any sort of particular greenhouse gas emitting activity like driving a car or what have you. Then there's the people who are very alarmed about sea level rise and climate change, who will say things like Miami Beach is going to be underwater in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and want the city to plan an exit strategy. And this is particularly people who are paying close attention to reports on climate change, and also people who tended to be sort of cynical about city government and about its ability to deal with the problem. But most people I talked to, I would say, had sort of this wait-and-see attitude. They may, you know, they're aware of climate change, don't think that it's not happening, maybe have growing concern, but they don't really have operational information that they can act on as far as making decisions about their lives. So they're mostly basing decisions on other factors, like I like living here, my family lives here, I have connections who live here, I like the environment, I like the city, you know, other sort of, all the things that you take into consideration when you make decisions about your life. The other thing I looked at was governance. So there's things happening at multiple levels of government with regards to climate change: state, watershed level, South Florida Water Management District, regional level at the compact I mentioned. The county had a climate change task force a few years ago and has restarted one now, and the city of Miami Beach. And so the first action that the city has taken on climate change is about stormwater master planning. And so this was in response to the increased flooding that the city had been seeing and that they had been getting complaints about. So the city had a stormwater master plan previously back from '97, which was something that they had done as a result of having to apply for, working with the county to apply for an EPA stormwater permit. So they had to create a stormwater master plan, but it was sort of basic and wasn't really using the stormwater models that are available now. So in 2009, they decided, with the increased flooding that had been happening, they decided we'll do a new stormwater master plan. They hired an engineering firm, and they're using these EPA models and to create like a much more comprehensive stormwater management plan. It's a 20-year plan, $206 million, which is going to result in higher user rates for the stormwater utility. And it also included sea level rise projections, and that was what was really interesting, because again, this was in 2009, which was the time when climate change has become extremely polarized, especially at the federal, nationally, and you just didn't really hear reports of cities or localities including it in their infrastructure planning at this time. But there were some people in Miami Beach City Public Works Department who were aware of climate change and thought it was something important to include in the plan, so that's what they did. And then the really interesting thing about that was that the criticisms that they got for doing that weren't from people who said climate change isn't happening, why are you including this in the plan, but from people who said you aren't including enough in the plan, your numbers aren't big enough for what's going to be happening. And so this is a diagram from the city's plan, which illustrates one of the challenges of planning for sea level rise or climate change. They're looking at the same NOAA data that I was looking at, and you've got this sort of average sea level over this epoch, which ends in 1995. So do you take a number from 1995 when you think that maybe sea level has risen in the meantime? Well, you can look at the averages for each year, which are of course all over the place because it's too short a time period to really understand what the true mean sea level is. And so they chose this number, which was essentially the last year of that they had for data available, and which was on the higher end, but not the highest end of the scale. And so from there, they applied the curve that I showed earlier in that graph that the regional compact had come up with, and then that's how they chose. I think so. We can talk about what happened. They, I think, initially chose the middle curve, and then because of the criticisms from activists who are really concerned about climate change, went with the upper curve. But that conflict and tension, I thought, was something interesting to show sort of the difficult realities of how you plan and how you deal with this issue. Oh, and the reason this is important, and I'm sorry if I'm not an engineer, I'm a sociologist, and so a lot of this has been kind of hard to get my head around, but those are essentially the boundary conditions that you use in your stormwater model. So when you have your stormwater model, you have a level that your tide or your water is at, so you can calculate the flow of the water from the street then out into the bay. And so that number has an influence on how much capacity you need in your stormwater plan. If you've got a higher boundary condition, you need more stormwater infrastructure in order to deal with the flooding and the rainfall. So that's why that number is important. So, looking to the future, Miami Beach obviously has a lot of challenges. It's low, it sees sea level rise coming. We've got this porous substrate of limestone, which is why those LIDAR sort of bathtub models are not necessarily an accurate prediction of what our area will look like. And so we're looking for solutions, ideas, approaches. And one of the ones they've been looking at is to the Netherlands, which has an interesting approach. The Netherlands is very famous for big water engineering projects, obviously dikes and pumps, and all the way back to the windmills. Back in 1200, the Netherlands has an 800-year history of water management and governance around water management. But the Dutch have also recently shifted their approach. They had some big floods in '95, which caused them to take sort of an assessment of what we've been doing and shift approaches. So whereas the approach used to be build bigger dikes, more pumps, more protection infrastructure, they've shifted approach now to more of an accommodation approach, so that there's more room for the water for periodic flooding. So when you get, say, a river or a storm and you get periodic flooding from the river, they've been creating more, doing some restoring of wetlands along rivers, even restoring rivers in some cases, and creating more room around the river so that the area can handle these floods periodically without causing damage to life or property. And so it's a shift from a total sort of hardening protection approach to more of an accommodation approach. So what makes Miami Beach vulnerable from all of this? We've got increased tidal flooding that interrupts businesses, damage property, and disrupts urban life. We've got larger infrastructure needs, which increase costs. We have a dense built-out urban area that has little room for relocation or that sort of room for the flexible water management. We've got uncertainty about sea level rise, which complicates planning and investment. The approach that's being used is adaptive management, which means that you monitor closely the conditions, the environmental conditions and sea level rise, and you sort of make decisions as you go and as you adapt as you go. And this is the approach that the Stormwater Management Plan has been taking, because they're essentially saying, well, we're going to have this 20-year plan, but we built into it flexibility so that if we need more capacity, we can have bigger pumps, or we can add, this or that. So it's not, they wouldn't be changing the entire approach of the stormwater plan, but they would be adjusting and adding capacity along the way, and that's sort of this adaptive management approach. But like I was saying, this requires new metrics. How do we measure what the impact of this flooding is, and how do we know when we need to increase our capacity, and the capacity for dealing with all of this as well. So local city government typically is stretched very thin. People don't necessarily have either the time or the training to deal with these sorts of things. So there's really a requirement for more capacity in order to implement these adaptive management approach. And then there's a lack of public process around the issue. The city did have some public meetings about the stormwater plan and about climate change, but they haven't done sort of this holistic planning or public engagement process around the issue, which means that people can feel excluded. Some are critical, others just don't know what's happening, and that is a vulnerability factor as well. But what I also found that was interesting while I was doing this research is that there's some sustainability aspects in Miami Beach as well. So Miami Beach actually has a pretty active citizenry. There's a lot of neighborhood activism and engagement with government, which I think is something that bodes well for dealing with climate change. There's growing environmental awareness and programming, like a new recycling ordinance. There's a support and leadership for adaptation planning among some of the city staff and citizens in the city. And Miami Beach has a walkable and affordable urban environment, which means it has lower carbon emissions. Miami Beach is actually number 10 in walking to work among cities over 65,000 residents, which I thought was really interesting. You look at this list here, these are all college towns except for Miami Beach. And so we have 10% walking and 7% biking, and this is census data. And the reason for this is because of the the pattern of urban development, which is dates back to the 30s, before a lot of people had cars, and so you have this sort of dense and compact walkable development with commercial strips interspersed, so you can walk to the store, you can walk and bike here and there. But it's also because of the economy on Miami Beach. So the big economy on Miami Beach is tourism, right? People working in hotels and restaurants. And most of these people who are biking and walking to work are those people working in the hotels and restaurants and accommodation and food services. Far more, 53% than the next highest categories of occupations. And you can see that also correlates with the low incomes that these folks have. And the average income of someone walking to work less than $15,000 a year. So what that means also is that the reason Miami Beach has all these people walking to work is because they can actually afford to still live there somewhere within walking or biking distance of where they're employed. So where I am right now with this is trying to get to a framework that is based on this sort of notion of vulnerability as produced. What are all the different physical and social economic drivers that are contributing to how the city is changing? Right now we're in this, I sort of jokingly called it engineering hoe. It's an engineering approach to dealing with climate change. We've been seeing hurricanes and storm surge. Let's see, we will probably see, in at least in the immediate future, less tidal flooding because of the infrastructure improvements, but there's growing concern. And then we've got an economy based on historic preservation, tourism, and real estate. And so what that means for vulnerability, I think, is that housing quality continues to be an issue, housing affordability. We've got a lot of elderly and immigrant populations who aren't as, for elderly certainly that was a risk factor in Hurricane Katrina, so not as mobile and not as able to deal with threats. And let's see, and then what we have here too, as we start to adapt and do planning around adaptation, is the consequences of those planning actions. So who gets included in the planning for climate change when we start to talk about things like insurance or zoning or spending a lot of money on infrastructure. You know, these all have implications, social justice and vulnerability implications. Who's paying for these things? Who's benefiting from them? Who gets to be included in that decision making? And it may be that at some point we get to a point where we've got more frequent flooding and are trying to accommodate more and more of this flooding because of sea level rise, which means that then we've got widespread concern about it, and that we have to dramatically adjust or transform our city and our social and economic system in order to deal with this. And what that looks like, we don't know because we can't see into the future. But how you know, what vulnerability will mean in that, I think depends on whether the adaptation that happens is more or less neoliberal. So whether it's more participatory, whether people are more included, we have more sort of safety net and protections, or whether we go the sort of collective, individual, sort of fend for yourself type of route. I think, I don't know, there's like two more of these, but basically vulnerabilities produce disruptions and loss from urban flooding, increasing costs for insurance and infrastructure, potential loss of equity or difficulty selling or renting property, and lack of information about potential sea level rise impacts.
You have 25 more minutes.
25 more minutes?
Yes.
Oh, well, I guess we'll do questions. What can, or I could talk about one more thing if you're interested. What can Miami Beach do to become more resilient? I'm very oriented towards public engagement with my work, and I've presented some of this also to the city of Miami Beach, and so I like to come up with what are some action things that we can do. And so I'd say that a population that's economically secure, healthy, informed, and connected is going to be the most resilient to climate change and sea level rise. Maintaining affordability for income levels, the people who are working here, that they can work and live within proximity to their work. Inclusive planning and information sharing, connecting adaptation projects with mitigation efforts. So this was interesting. There's a project that's happening now on Alton Road where it's not actually the city's stormwater plan, it's the state stormwater, the state that's redoing Alton Road and improving the drainage under Alton Road. So what that means is that they're digging up the road, and when you dig up the road, that means you have to replace the road that's on top. And so there's a coalition of residents who have gotten together on Miami Beach and are demanding that when that road is reconstructed, that it have bike lanes, it has wider sidewalks, it has trees, it has more crosswalks, it has all these things that enhance the pedestrian-friendly environment, which obviously improves the ability of people to walk to the places that they need to get, which contributes to lower carbon emissions. So to the extent that we can take these adaptation projects that we have to do to deal with flooding or other impacts of climate change and incorporate the mitigation side, the reducing emissions side, is an important piece of the strategy, I think. And promoting sustainability initiatives is a key part of the city's identity and quality of life, especially among 15 million visitors per year. There was an interesting study I was reading from the Netherlands where they studied people's perceptions about one of these projects I was talking about, where they essentially restored a riverbed to deal as a flood protection measure, and so it was a polder, which is sort of this like flat farmland, which is kind of soggy because the water table is high there, and and it had been historically a riverbed, so they restored the riverbed, created some more wetlands, and then that created a place for water to go when there was this periodic flooding. And when they studied people's perceptions, what they thought about the plan, what they found was that people were sort of, they didn't really necessarily believe it was going to help protect them from flooding, but they like nature, and they like the wetlands, and they like living in a place where they could view this nature. So, so for folks who are concerned about climate change and about adapting, we have to keep in mind that people are as much interested in their present quality of life as they are in the future impacts of something like climate change. So I think that, is it.
Yeah, on this issue of vulnerability, you seem to be talking mostly about just sort of I was going to say the hydrological impacts, or the hydrological vulnerability of flooding, but you're also, at this stage, just looking at it's really an inconvenience if having to put out the board so that customers can get in the store. And just my other background here is, the vulnerability analysis that I've seen, I work in Mexico and developing countries, is mostly around, vulnerability of the poor and economic vulnerability.
Right.
Now, when you think about economic vulnerability in Miami Beach, I mean, there's the one stereotype reality that it's a quite wealthy place in general. So wealth would make you less vulnerable. But just imagining some of the variations in that. I mean, if you're a food service worker renting an apartment in the Art Deco district, let's say you're not really particularly vulnerable because you're just renting and you can pick up and leave, and there's going to be food service jobs elsewhere. If you own one of the apartments in one of the high-rise condos south of Fifth, and it's your second or third home, you're not very vulnerable because you can absorb that loss. If you're if you're the owner of one of those single-family residences in South Beach, which there's a fair number around, and if in some cases you're a typical middle-class family and all your wealth is in that home, then that would make you more vulnerable. Your home may be worth $1 million, but you're vulnerable because that's all your wealth is there where it could be flooded. So I mean, have you just thought about vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the things you said are true, and part of the complicated, this word is complicated, like you said, and it's a complicated part of conceptualizing this research project of how to deal with that. And like you mentioned, part of the difficulty is that, like I mentioned, this sort of original political ecology research, you had people studying in developing countries where it was sort of more clear, this link between environmental change and your livelihoods. If you're growing things and you can't grow them the same way, or you get flooded out, there's sort of that obvious link. And then for a situation like we're in, where your livelihood is your selling your labor in a market, and maybe you're renting, what exactly is it that makes you vulnerable there? So so one of those is, like you mentioned, the sort of real estate dimension of this, the fact that you have this money invested in a particular piece of property, and if you're very wealthy, like there are a lot of people on Miami Beach who are wealthy, although, you know, there are people who are investing their life, you know, they see that as their savings as well across the income spectrum. But that's also one of the difficult things about, I mean, some people actually see, I mean, you didn't say that as being vulnerable, but to some people it sort of is, and that the first slide that I had up there was that map of the vulnerable cities around the world, and so Miami is on there precisely because it has this economic assets that are threatened. But sort of a true sense of vulnerability, I think, which is your ability to cope with the impact. I did talk to some middle-income, single-family homeowners in Miami Beach, a family who had lived there for 20 or 30 years in a home that now needed a lot of repair, and they're sort of like, well, do we put money into this, but are we going to be here, you know, in a couple decades? And, you know, and that is, you know, I would say part of the vulnerability, I think, is that lack of knowledge and lack of actionable ability to gauge your risk. It's almost like, what is your risk tolerance when you're talking about something like your investments or your savings in there, based on information that, you know, none of us has a real super concrete idea about, as far as you're making your own household financial decisions. So it's extremely complicated, and there's growing concern about it. Obviously, we've seen with the whole flood insurance debate too. And so you get some of the officials who have started to say things like, well, we can't be viewing property as investment anymore. And that's sort of a startling thing to say. I mean, that's a big shift in our economic system, but but it may come to that. Yeah?
I have a follow-up.
Can you go back to the graph where you looked at the sidewalk?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you going to collect data for 2013 to see if there's a high peak?
Great idea. Great suggestion. I should, yeah.
Because like it's saying about it's like what happens in the face of the
Yeah, that's a really great idea. I would say also, I live on Miami Beach, so I also see this every day, and I would say that 2013 is probably about the same. Like, we've had a lot of flooding this year too. But yeah, to go look at the data, that would be do that. Yeah.
During your research, has anybody said, like, especially the older generation who lives here, do they say that oh, it's happening in 30 to 40 years, I might not be here, so I don't really care, you know?
Yeah, I've had people, some people express that as well, although, and so one of the, so the research that I did is qualitative, right, with the interviews. So you do a sample of about, I think it's about 10 household interviews and 10 businesses, and then I think around 15 with the officials, and so from that you can't really say, I mean, I know I said sort of like most people or some people, but you really can't generalize from that small of a sample size to, you know, what most people are thinking. So I'm really trying to do is piece out what those perceptions are related to and sort of what the thinking is behind it. But I did have people say that I won't be here. So I think one of the people who was saying that was also didn't have anything a renter, so didn't have something invested. So that might be a factor in it too. You know, how concerned you are about the issue. Yeah?
Great work. And my question is about building codes. Did you have an opportunity to take a look at that and see what they're projecting for the future, or are they actually incentivizing people to move out of these really vulnerable building structures and building on pylons and doing that sort of thing from a city level, and kind of forces people's hand then to get out of the place where they're vulnerable?
Yeah, so I looked at building, I didn't look at the building code per se, but at flood insurance regulations. And so Miami Beach participates in the flood insurance program and has this community rating system status, which means that it's already implemented a set of regulations on buildings that make buildings more flood proof. And one of them is that when you build a new building, you have to build above the floodplain, which on South Beach is about 8 feet. So if say your ground is like 3 to 4 feet, and then the floodplain is 8, so you've got to be up, like a floor. And so that applies to new buildings. And so what you'll see in new buildings is that they have parking garages on the first floor, and then you've got your living space above that, and you're supposed to have your building systems also above the floodplain level. So your elevators have a mechanism, so if there's a flood, the elevator sort of automatically goes up to the second floor or the top floor or something to prevent that damage. So so there's that, which applies to new residential buildings, and then you've got commercial buildings commercial buildings is sort of not, you can't really do that as well, to have your commercial space up on the second floor because people are walking by, and how you get up to the second floor. So commercial buildings don't have that requirement, but they are required to have these flood panel things that they put in front of the doors, which I should have put some, I think I had a sandbag picture up there. I saw a few people using those panels, but really more they would use sandbags to prevent the water from coming into this door, because if you've got this panel, it's sort of like hard to step over into, but sandbags you can kind of arrange and people can step over them to go into the store. But to go back to, I think the code issue, so there's a couple of things. One is that, what do you do with all the older buildings, the buildings that were grandfathered into the program, that were built before the flood program started in 1978, which most of the buildings on Miami Beach are. So that's been an issue we've seen recently in this debate about flood insurance, and where there's this move, or the federal program to move away from subsidies to try to encourage people not to build in coastal or low elevation areas. But you've got this whole stock in communities of buildings that are pre that era, so it's really tricky. And then the other thing that's relevant on Miami Beach is that it affects the historic preservation issue. So Miami Beach has all these Art Deco buildings that are really famous. This was how Miami Beach revived itself in the 80s, was by promoting these and rehabbing these historic Art Deco buildings. And so now you want to say, well, these all have to be raised, or what do we do with them? And so it's a debate right now in the historic preservation community. What do we do to these buildings? And when people are building new things, some people, especially like single-family homes, a lot of what's happening is that in some of the single-family home neighborhoods, they're being torn down and built into even bigger and wealthier houses. And some of those are being built up above the floodplain, but then you've got older ones that are still down there, or people who don't want to, you know, do we end up with a situation where you have some buildings that are like here and some that are down there, so it's stuff that has to be worked out, yeah. Yeah?
So, I mean, you from what you say, there's more of a sense of community engagement on Miami Beach, and that should help with adapting to rise or making some kind of progress.
Yeah.
How would you project that to the rest of Miami-Dade County, where you don't really have that sense of identity of individual community?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to say, and even on Miami Beach, I mean, even with the example of the Alton Road project now, which, I mean, that project is about drainage and stormwater, but people are really most interested in what's happening on top of the street, much more interested in what's going on top than they are in what's going on underneath. So I would say even in Miami Beach, I think the fact that there is a lot of community engagement around resident and neighborhood issues bodes well for dealing with this issue, but I wouldn't say it's happened yet to where you have, you know, like an inclusive or comprehensive public process. And for the rest of the county, I mean, so, you know, looking at different jurisdictions and different political administrations that come in, so on the state level we had Charlie Crist in 2007 who did actually work on a Florida plan for climate change. But then when he decided he was running for the Senate and when the next governor came in, that like went out the window. And so then you get these regional, like the compact taking up the issues and moving and developing their regional plans. And so the regional plan is like the thing that's moving the most. And what they've done is they created a whole set of like 100 recommendations for infrastructure and zoning and water and energy and agriculture and all sorts of stuff. So that plan is actually a really good template, and what the city of Miami Beach has done is take those recommendations and study them and say, which of these can we implement in our city, what are we responsible for, and what can we do here? So a lot of it is sort of does boil down to a city level of whether cities are you know, how they're going to move on this issue, and a lot of that is just about educating city officials. So elected officials who are working on this issue say to the community members, talk to your elected officials and make them come to these conferences and things like the Climate Compact Conference is actually tomorrow and Friday up in Broward County, and they're going to have a town hall in the evening with some congresspeople, I think. And so I would say for the immediate future it looks pretty uneven. And then it depends on if you can get the county government, you know, on a whole sort of really on board with this. And then that might do something for the cities that are not so on top of it. But in the immediate term, it looks like the cities are leading the way, the ones that are doing something.
But I think you mentioned that, you know, probably all this, you know, $200 billion worth of infrastructure investment will probably reduce flooding in the short to medium term, 5 to 10 years. So I think, you know, if there's no longer the flooding, you know, that's the sort of immediate warning sign. I mean, that's not going to help people focus on the issue.
Yeah.
Where's that money going to come from?
There's some bonds, which is also sort of interesting. When you look at raising money over your future financial capacity, and I mean, there's like 100 million questions about this issue, right? But does some investment firm at some point question Miami Beach's ability to pay back these bonds in 20 or 30 years, and then how does that affect the city's ability to raise money through bonds? So it's bonds, and then it's also raising the stormwater utilities, so what people pay through their utility bills, taxes.
John Gustafson, you know him?
Yeah.
Well, he was the former Speaker of the Florida House, and he's now a an administrator at FIU. His vision for the future of Miami is really chilling. I mean, basically we have a raised city, keeping up with sea level rise, that forms a prosperous urban development Singapore style, connected by a causeway to the United States, basically over the sea. I am not joking, and there are planning documents that present this vision. It's absolutely I wasn't ready for it.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about that is when people are looking to the future and they're looking for some way to grasp this and visualize it, and so there are several of these sort of models floating out there, and Tom, he definitely has his, I think, Singapore, and the Keys is another one, the Miami Keys, I've seen people say. So this is the idea that as water level rises, the high ground areas essentially become a series of islands, sort of like the Florida Keys. Venice is another thing. People on Miami Beach are always talking about Venice, because people in Venice, they're used to sort of walking canals and also dealing with flooding and walking on little planks that they put up over the sidewalks on water.
Venice couldn't survive without the mainland. Venice is more than Venice, which is that little historic core. It's the mainland. Most of the people in the area live in Mestre, and they are on the mainland. And
right.
Right.
And so then I think that goes to the point too of what is Miami Beach's economic future and economic position. What are the economic drivers here, and what's needed to support that, and is it completely local, or how connected is it regionally or otherwise? And what's interesting about these discourses too is that they shape how people act, right? So like what you think and what you believe about and what you visualize about the future also shapes how people act and communicate and talk, and that feeds into the adaptation planning and things. Anything else?
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.